Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Podcast on the Brink. Big Ten Media Days are this Thursday and Friday in Indianapolis. And to coincide with that, we're actually recording this on a Tuesday, but Wednesday morning, the official, unofficial media poll will be released for the Big Ten this season. A little bit of background on this. The Big Ten does not give us a full preseason media poll. So Brendan Quinn of The Athletic and Adam Jardy of the Columbus Dispatch each year, I think now for 4 or 5 years, have surveyed the media in the preseason to get their picks for the league. Everyone that votes sends in their predicted order of finish 1 through 14, their preseason all Big Ten team, their pick for player of the year, freshman of the year, and their all league team. And the two representatives that vote for Indiana are myself and my guest this week on Podcast on the Brink, Zach Osterman of the Indianapolis Star, who has a sweet Atlanta Braves hat on. MLB playoffs starting this week. I know Zach and I are both excited. Our respective teams made the postseason, but Zach, we're not here to talk baseball. We're here to talk Big Ten preseason media poll. First of all, just take me through how you approach this each year. Obviously, there's been a lot of turnover in the league. 3 new coaches, a lot of players gone. I want to get through the poll, but I'm just curious, like from your perspective, how do you go about putting together your poll each year? What are you looking at, and what are some of the key things you consider?
Well, I mean, I doubt I have any sort of magic formula to it. It is just kind of considering a little bit of what teams have coming back, what they've added, what their sort of schedule looks like. Although I'll admit that I don't sit there and I don't look at all 20 games for all 14 teams and say that this seems harder than that or whatever. But I kind of try to, and then I try to, I feel like I probably never vote Tom Izzo lower than 5th. There's some trends that I tend to try and follow more closely. But what I think really the one thing that I do just to organize in my own mind is almost kind of group teams. And I thought that was a little bit harder this year for me than most years. I think the talent drain in the Big Ten is maybe a little bit deeper than people realize. Like I think the Big Ten's got some really, really good players back at the top. Like if you look at this, I guess I'll go ahead and spoil one of these. But the first team all league is Kofi Coburn, E.J. Little, Hunter Dickinson, Jaden Ivey, Trace Jackson Davis. I mean, that's a really good first team. There's a lot of talent there, and even if you kind of dig into some of the other guys that were getting votes, like Trevion Williams or Andre Curbelo, who I love, Eric Ayala, Ron Harper Jr., there's talent. I think really more what it feels like the Big Ten has lost is kind of the meat on the bones. There's been just, if you look at it, most teams in the league, basically it feels like just about everybody but Purdue has lost 1 or 2 key pieces, and is trying to figure out a way to replace those. I guess Michigan State maybe hasn't lost any. No, they lost Aaron Henry. What am I talking about? And so it was a little bit harder for me to just sort of say, like, what do I think? What do I know? What do I hope about the Big Ten this year? I mean, it's I can tell you what I think. I'm not sure what to hope, and I struggled more with what I feel like I know. But I do think I kind of settled about where the voters more or less settled. Maybe I've rated Michigan State a little bit higher than most people. But I mean, it is, to me, there's kind of a clear separation at the top. For me, there's Michigan, there's Purdue, maybe Ohio State. And then after that, there is a fairly pronounced drop. And there's almost kind of this group of teams that might go from like 4 all the way down to like 10, where I could make you a case that this team could finish 4th. And I could make you a case that this team could finish 10th. or certainly at least ninth. 10th maybe a little bit liberal, but certainly at least ninth. And so that leaves open all sorts of questions for me about, like, how deep is the league? Are we going to look at it as a 7-8 bid league like we have in the past, or is it going to be a year where this sort of rocky middle winds up not as good as we expected and doesn't pick up the wins it needs? And, we're maybe talking about a 5 bid league or a 6 bid league come March. It's hard for me to peg. And so I just kind of tried to group it, as best I could, and then, kind of rank within those groups. And that's kind of where I fell out.
So looking at the team kind of results here, it's interesting because I kind of wanted to do tiers of teams, but at the same time, when you look at kind of the points, there's like a point system that they've developed in terms of assigning a value to each team. I mean, you look at Michigan and Purdue, they ended up with the same amount of points. Michigan gets the tiebreaker for having one more person pick them first. So basically a draw for them being picked to win the league. Then you have Illinois and Ohio State 3 and 4 just kind of right grouped together. And then there's a pretty pronounced drop off to Maryland and Michigan State. Another drop off takes you below that to Indiana and Rutgers. Another drop off to Iowa and Wisconsin. So I agree with you that there's an interesting, I think, line. I may be a little bit higher on Illinois than you are, but I kind of had, Michigan, Purdue, Illinois, and Ohio State as the teams that I looked at the top. After that, it gets real interesting with Maryland, Michigan State, Indiana, Rutgers, Iowa, and Wisconsin. Ultimately, you had Indiana 6th in your picks. I had them in 8th. Neither you or I were the highest on Indiana or the lowest. Where does, in your mind, Indiana fit in with those teams? I mean, they're closer. If you look at the points, they're closer to Michigan State and Maryland than they are to Iowa and Wisconsin. But it feels like, from that Maryland to Wisconsin group, that there's a lot of room for interpretation and what could actually happen when the season plays out.
Yeah, no, I think it is kind of tiers in one sense. Like, I don't think anybody should be surprised to see Purdue and Michigan basically tied to pick. I think those are the two teams that I think everybody in the conference feels like should be setting the pace this year. I know I'm maybe a little bit lower on Illinois than most people, and I had him 5th. And I mean, of my deep and abiding love for Andre Curbelo. I think he's a fantastic player. I look at that team and how much that team counted on Io a year ago, and I get having Kofi back, and I think Kofi Coburn is a great player. I think there were times where Illinois was kind of at odds with itself and trying to be small and fast and hard to deal with, but then also try to be sort of on defense, sort of methodical, and really play into sort of funneling teams into the post to let Kofi Coburn's defensive ability really take over games. Maybe they won't have to do as much of that this year, but when you're talking about losing a guy that took 347 shots and used 29.5% of possessions while he was on the floor, I just like that is an enormous amount of contribution to lose. And then the guy that we at least sort of thought was maybe kind of the heir apparent for him, Adam Miller, is obviously also out the door. And so I think Illinois, I probably see Illinois a little bit closer to that tier you talked about of kind of Maryland, Michigan State, Indiana, Rutgers, maybe even if you want to swing in Iowa or Wisconsin. Like, if you ask me who my maybe sort of surprise team in the Big Ten this year, I wouldn't be shocked if Nebraska finished in the top 9. I'm not saying they will, but I wouldn't be shocked because I think Fred Hoiberg has finally really started to entrench his system there and push the talent level up there. And that's the kind of team that could just sort of, get on a good start, and all of a sudden all the pressure's off and they're just feeling good and they're picking up wins, that they don't expect. And then you look up at the end of the season and they've won 9 Big Ten games, But I think Indiana is dead kind of in the middle of that let's say 3rd through 9th pack. And I think obviously Indiana's got to replace Armand Franklin. Obviously they're dealing with a coaching change, although And this isn't even necessarily a reflection of Mike Woodson is definitely a better coach than Archie Miller, but more just for the freshness, the newness of it. I think having a new coach is a real strength for Indiana. I think the one thing that would set kind of Indiana apart from a lot of those teams, because I think we all know what Indiana's weaknesses are. We got to know that they can be more consistent defensively, and we have to see them shoot threes or hit threes. Like, we have to see that happen. Not necessarily they have to be the best in the country, but they've got to be effective enough at it to make everything else work offensively. But by the same token, if I'm looking at them compared to Maryland, or I'm looking at them compared to Michigan State or Rutgers or Iowa, there are things, assuming they're healthy, that I can say I know. Again, talking about what I know, what I think, what I hope. I can say right now, I know Trayce Jackson-Davis is a 20-10 player. And I know his teammates know that. And I know his teammates know how to get that out of him. I know Race Thompson is a really solid, at the baseline, even removing the potential for him to become a little bit more of a perimeter player, a little bit more of a stretch four. I know he's a 10-5, a 10-6 kind of power forward that's a really good sort of complement to Trayce Jackson-Davis. I know this team has depth at point guard. I know this team is maybe not experienced together, but you look at those lineups Indiana was running out, starting lineups in the Bahamas. You're talking about fourth-year point guard, fourth-year forward. I guess you'd really kind of call Parker Stewart like a third-year guard because he's obviously sat out some time. Third-year forward, fourth-year forward. I mean, I know it's an incredibly experienced team, and then you go onto the bench and you've got Rob Finney is probably your first man off the bench. You've got sophomores who've seen a ton of time. You got a transfer like Michael Durr. The youngest guy they're probably going to wind up counting on is Tamar Bates, who I think has the potential to be a fantastic player long term. So my point is, if I'm thinking through that sort of lens of, well, what do I think? What do I know? What do I think? What do I hope? And hope's not quite the right word because we're not cheering for Indiana, but you get what I'm saying. About Indiana, I do feel like there's a lot that I can be confident in. Now, the stuff that I can't be confident in is the stuff that has put a ceiling on Indiana for the last 3 or 4 years. And so that's kind of the one piece of it where you say, well, you can't be sure that this ceiling is going to raise considerably until you can see them do some of this stuff. Again, particularly defensive consistency and really hitting threes. But I do look at, Maryland has remade a lot of its roster with transfers. Michigan State has talent and has Tom Izzo, and those two should never be counted out. I think that's pretty much why I voted him fourth. But obviously after last season, I think that's a program and a group that needed to kind of do some soul searching. And then, Iowa lost a ton, Wisconsin lost a ton, and even Rutgers. I know people like Rutgers, and I get it. The one thing I would worry about with Rutgers is they lost a huge piece defensively in Miles Johnson, and you don't like rim protectors are not players you just replace. Like, you don't just distribute their minutes to someone else because no one else does what they do. And I used to say this about Tim Miles, Nebraska, when they'd have a good season and then they'd come back the next year and really nothing had changed. It was still the same players. It was still kind of the same system. Everything felt the same. And so it's like, well, you're trying to run it back, even though the conference had an entire offseason to study you, pick apart your weaknesses, and figure out how to attack you differently. And that's kind of where I'm at a little bit with Rutgers and Geo Baker and Ron Harper. So I think basically the reason I had Indiana sixth, I'm trying to find my ballot here to remind myself because, we submit these things and then the way it goes, we forget everything else. The one team in kind of that top 7 that I had them in front of was Maryland, and that to me is just a coin toss based on essentially whether Indiana can hit threes and how quickly Maryland can kind of bring its roster back together because of the transfers and counting on so many new faces. But other than that, I do feel like Indiana, at least right now, there's more that you can believe in, more that you can rely on with Indiana than Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska. And if they can hit some threes, then I think you do kind of start to push them up closer to the kind of the Illinois tier, the Ohio State tier of maybe not a team that finishes like top 3 in the conference, but maybe top 5.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I've kind of been a little lower on Indiana than some, but I think that's more of just the last, you know, every season since 2005, 15, 16, I don't want to say they've underperformed to expectations every year, but most of the time they have underwhelmed. So I'm more at the show me stage of following the results year in, year out, and until I see them, uh, you know, being capable of being a top half Big Ten team, I've got them kind of right there in the middle of the pack, and we'll see how it all shakes out. I want to talk about the preseason All Big Ten team as well, because you had an unconventional vote there for your Player of the Year. I won't say unconventional because I think it's a potentially good pick, depending on how this particular team season goes. But the preseason All Big Ten team, kind of in order of votes: Kofi Coburn received the most votes, EJ Liddell of Ohio State second, Hunter Dickinson third, Jaden Ivey of Purdue fourth, and Trace Jackson Davis of Indiana fifth. And a pretty big gap between Trace and Travion Williams. He was the next in receiving votes. Kofi Coburn named preseason Big Ten Player of the Year. Not surprising, but Zach, you voted Jaden Ivey of Purdue as your pick for Player of the Year. I actually like the pick. It wouldn't shock me to see it happen. But what was kind of your rationale there? Were you just not as high on maybe Kofi as others, or was it something you saw particularly with Jaden Ivey that made you want to pick him as your
yeah, I mean, it's a couple things. First of all, I will admit that it is a little bit of a futures pick. Like I'm counting on Jaden Ivey to have taken a couple steps forward. I thought he was a good player last year, obviously. But if you kind of look at it, like there are ways in which he clearly still needs to get better. He needs to shoot the three better. He probably needs to, for his position. I'm not saying he needs to be a point guard, but for his position, you could probably look at him and say, hey, if you're going to be a player that is at that level, you probably create for your teammates a little bit more just based on the attention you draw on the floor. But I thought he also had some moments last season where he was just, frankly unbelievable. And he also, the other thing I would say too is obviously I think he was playing hurt for a while and he kind of tailed off near the end of the season, at the beginning of the season, and then kind of really picked it up as the season went on. I mean, he had 26 points in the NCAA tournament loss, but it is kind of counting. My vote is kind of counting on Jaden Ivey to take a step forward a little bit. I also thought it was kind of funny in the sense that like he got the fourth most All Big Ten votes, but he got the second most Player of the Year votes. In the way that these things kind of go sometimes, like he was fourth in kind of the voting blocks, thinking on, basically who deserves to be first team, but second in who deserves to be Player of the Year. The other thing too with Kofi, and this is kind of the biggest. My opinion of Illinois is probably my biggest capacity for being embarrassed here, in the sense that if like Nebraska finishes second, we're all going to be surprised. And if they've got the guys to pick up that volume of scoring and that volume of shooting, then fair enough. They'll be one of the top three teams in the league. I'll acknowledge it right now. The one piece of it for me with Kofi is just you got a good point guard there to help you if you're big, but I think we all kind of appreciate that Kofi Coburn pretty much is what he is offensively at this point. And he's really good offensively, but that means you're probably not going to see him stepping out and hitting threes. You're not going to see him, trying to play point forward or anything like that. And so if you've got a team that's going to struggle at all to space the floor around him, and they may not, but if you've got a team that's going to struggle at all to space the floor around him and to kind of give him the perimeter scoring balance that doesn't allow teams to just collapse on him and just kind of sag hard anytime he's got the ball within 10 feet of the rim, because they don't have to try, they don't have to respect maybe more than one other player on the floor at any given time. I just think there's going to be nights where he struggles. And that's not really a reflection on him so much as it is Ayo Dosunmu leaves a huge hole in that roster. And I think that Kofi was the player. I think Kofi was more important to Illinois' turnaround in the sense that he gave them a defensive identity. And if they change the way they play, completely to suit him and only him, fair enough. But Io was the guy that got volume. Io was the guy that scared you. Like Kofi was a problem around the rim, but Io was the guy that if you were in the last 5 minutes of a tight game, you thought that's where our dream can die. It wasn't with Kofi; it was with Io, and I mean, I think I'm almost certain I voted Io DeSumo. Maybe I didn't vote him. I think I toyed with it, and then Garza was just too strong down the stretch to not vote Big Ten Player of the Year, but. I think in all of the sort of understandable excitement for Illinois getting Kofi Cockburn back, because for a long time it was kind of gospel he wasn't coming back, I think we've kind of forgotten that they lost a really big piece. And that they don't, at least as far as we know, and maybe, I think they've got a couple of really good freshmen. Maybe there's somebody there that can be that quicker than we think. But
I think Trent Frazier coming back has some importance. I mean, he's not going to be Io, but he's also going to be a guy that can, I think with Curbelo out there creating, I think Trent Frazier and Kofi are going to have some opportunities to get pretty favorable looks. One thing you have to remember about Curbelo last year was off the bench. So this year it's kind of going to be, we'll see. It could be a great thing, him in the starting lineup and him running the offense at all times, as opposed to having to defer it to Io at times. I think any bet on Illinois being a contender to actually win the Big Ten is a bet that Andre Curbelo is going to be the best point guard in the league.
I think that's fair. And I think, again, that I think from the moment I saw him, I was like, this kid's going to be fantastic. But he was 5 of 31 from 3 last year. So that tells you, A, he wasn't a good three-point shooter, and B, he knew that, and he wasn't interested in shooting threes. Trent Frazier took, I'm doing the math as we talk, 245 shots last season. That's just a little over half of what, Io DeSumo attempted more than 400. Now, Frazier was more of a three-point threat. I'll give you that. I think sometimes we can gloss over how tough it is for big players, how tough it is to replace a guy that is a big player and a big personality. Because the other thing is Illinois, again, I think Kofi was more important to the way that Brad Underwood turned Illinois around, but Illinois embraced Io. He was their heartbeat, and they believed that Io DeSumo, that there wasn't a hole Io DeSumo could not dig them out of. That was their identity in some ways. And that's fine. He was a fantastic player. I'm not criticizing them for that. But now he's gone. And I think that there's a natural sort of inclination to assume that replacing him will be easier. To assume replacing a player like that will be easier than it is. We've seen it in Indiana in the past too. There's been, Tom Crean coached teams where, like Yogi Ferrell's a great example. We thought Indiana had, that 2016-17 team. We looked at and we said, okay, Yogi Ferrell's gone, but they've still got OG Anunoby. They've still got Thomas Bryant. They've still got James Blackman. They've still got Rob Johnson. And Josh Newkirk, he's not as good as Yogi Ferrell, but he's an experienced point guard. He'll step in and other guys will just, rise to kind of meet the road. That season was going off the rails well before OG Anunoby tore his ACL. Because the piece that glued everything else together the previous season just couldn't be replaced. And I kind of suspect Io is that piece. And I think you're right about Curbelo. I think if Illinois is a top 2, top 3 team in the conference, it's because Andre Curbelo is a first-team All-Big Ten level point guard.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say kind of just about your point about Illinois, the same point kind of applies maybe in not as drastic because none of the guys that these other teams lost are as impactful as Io, but you look at Ohio State. They lost Dwayne Washington and C.J. Walker. Maryland lost Aaron Wiggins and Daryl Morcell. Michigan State, Aaron Henry's gone. Rocket Watts is gone. Rutgers, Miles Johnson and Jacob Young are gone. Iowa. Go down the list. Everybody.
Armand Franklin in Indiana,
Right,
who was
right, exactly.
who was key for them last year.
And Michigan lost guys, but I think the difference with Michigan is now we've seen it for a couple of years. They're bringing back Eli Brooks, who's one of the more experienced guards in the league, one of the best defenders. They're bringing back Hunter, and they're bringing in a freshman class and a transfer that are a little bit more proven maybe than some of these other teams. Like Ohio State, people are betting on Jamari Wheeler to be their point guard. Now, Jamari Wheeler's been a point guard in the Big Ten, but he's never been a point guard on a great team. He's been at Penn State. So I have a harder time buying that than I do a Michigan or a Purdue, where I kind of know the quantity or the quality of the player that they're going to have at those spots. The last thing I want to ask you about before we get out of here, Trace Jackson Davis, obviously picked on the preseason All Big Ten team, but the last guy picked, the fifth pick, got 3 votes for Big Ten preseason player of the year, neither vote from you or I. I mean, what do you make of Trace coming into this season? You mentioned you think he's a 20-10 guy. My question is, all right, he's been a stats guy on bad teams the last 2 years. Can he be maybe those numbers come down a little bit, but he's a little bit more efficient and he's got better players around him? Can that lead to more winning for Indiana, or does Indiana need him to be dominant every night to reach their full potential?
I mean, for me, it's kind of the latter in the sense that I think, yes, you're right. He's kind of been, I think some of the numbers have felt empty to people because Indiana as a team has not won. Although, when we have these conversations, it is always worth pointing out Indiana was almost certainly going to the NCAA tournament his freshman year. And then, I would say it was a 99.9% certainty they were in that field. And if I'm not mistaken, they were actually going to play Iowa the next day, and that was a team that they matched up pretty favorably against. And so it wasn't hard to see Indiana already Friday of that Big Ten tournament, and then Trace Jackson Davis isn't wearing that label around his neck. I think really though, like he could be a little bit more efficient, but if you can shoot the ball better, then you probably get a slightly more efficient Trace Jackson Davis. Just because it's Penn State. Thank you for clearing that up for me. Forgive me. But again, that was a game that they won in 3 weeks earlier. And it was a game where you could again kind of see, especially in a building that was going to be very pro IU, a game that could potentially have kind of swung their way. Anyway, the point is, I think you get a more efficient Trace Jackson Davis if you space the floor better for him. I think you get not just efficient from a statistical perspective. I think when we use the word efficiency, we are nearly always talking about statistical efficiency. Also the efficiency of, just being able to go through a stretch where he just hits 4 shots in 4 possessions and takes over a game. Because one of the things you could rely on if you were an opponent the last couple years was that if Trace Jackson Davis ever really got loose, the likelihood was either there was going to be a matchup that you could adjust on the floor in that moment to essentially pull an extra body away from somebody that you didn't have to respect as a threat to score. Or if you were patient, it wasn't going to take you more than 90 seconds, 2 minutes for Indiana to have to rotate that way and bring somebody in where you could say, okay, now you're going to overhelp anytime Jackson Davis has the ball because we don't have to respect your man's ability to score. Not consistently anyway. And I think the other piece too with Jackson Davis, and this is where you look at Michael Durr, who has had some, his by all accounts is not 100% right now, did not play in the Bahamas. Logan Duncombe, who I think is 100% now, didn't play in the Bahamas but is back now. The other thing with Trace Jackson Davis is, can you get to a point where you're not playing him 36 minutes a night? If you can get to a point where you're playing him 32 minutes a night, I think you're going to get a better Jackson Davis night in, night out. And so that's kind of the other piece of it as well is, can you give him a little bit more adequate relief? Because last season, once Joey Brunk went down, and I know Joey Brunk was a player that could divide opinions among certain sections of Indiana's fan base, but Joey Brunk could give you quality, operable Big Ten minutes, Big Ten level minutes in the post in a way that really nobody else on that team last year could. Not at that 5 spot, not in the way Archie Miller wanted to play, and they missed him badly throughout the season in part because it wore Trace Jackson Davis down and wore him out. And I think you need a lot of the same player, in terms of he can always get better rebounding the ball, but finishing, drawing fouls, rim protection, on the slide, he's fantastic at defending without fouling. But I think what you need is more complementary players around him, which is a fancy way of saying you need to hit some threes. And I think the other thing you need is can you get to a point where you're playing him just a little bit less? Not a ton less, but just a little bit less so that the wear and tear over the course of a whole season isn't quite so intense.
Well, Zach, I said we wouldn't talk baseball, but before we get out of here, I got to get your picks for at least your team, the Braves. I mean, it feels like the Braves are in the playoffs. I've always been jealous of you being a Braves fan. You guys are in the playoffs almost every year. How are you feeling going into to this year's playoffs with your team and just kind of looking at everything big picture? What do you who do you think maybe is the best team just entering this playoffs where we know anything can happen?
Yeah, I mean, if you're asking me to pick a favorite, it's probably still the Dodgers. I mean, it's nuts what they have. Like they've got. And they're in the
one game playoff.
I know. And if that had been if I was the Giants, the one thing I wanted to avoid was facing a hot Cardinals team in a 1-game playoff. And the Cardinals could still beat the Dodgers. Don't get me wrong, but this may sound stupid because I think that game's tonight. So we're talking, and this is going to come out after that game is played, and the Cardinals are going to win, and I'm going to look like an idiot. Like you've got 2 future Hall of Fame pitchers in that rotation, and neither one of them is the best pitcher on the team. Like neither one of them has had the best season. And it's not like those are future Hall of Famers that are just playing out the string. Kershaw's a little older, but Scherzer I think still led the NL in ERA this year. If not, he was very close. And I don't know who they're starting to. I would start Scherzer, but Urias probably had the best season of any of them. If you just look top to bottom, kind of front to back. So. I mean, for me, it's the Braves, or excuse me, it's the Braves. It's the Dodgers, or maybe the Rays. As for the Braves, I mean, it's been an enjoyable season in the sense that it shouldn't have happened. It was very frustrating. They weren't over 500 for the first time until mid-July, and even then, they weren't permanently over 500 until kind of early August. They had a lot of injuries. Obviously, the Marcell Ozuna situation, which is really gross and kind of its own discussion. But, just the, Mike Soroka never threw a pitch, and Acuna, and Fried was hurt for a while. Ian Anderson was hurt for a while. But quietly, I think a lot of people see the Braves as an afterthought going into the playoffs, and I understand why. But basically, from the time they traded for Jock Peterson, they're more or less playing 100-win baseball. If you go look, and they played 71 games. I looked this up yesterday just because I was curious. I saw somebody talking about it. They played 71 games after they traded for Peterson, and that was the first of their big, pre-trade deadline acquisitions. And their win percentage from that point equated to about a 100-win season. So they've got 2, if not 3, really solid frontline starters. They got a good bullpen. Their pitching is not as good as the Brewers, and that could wind up being the difference, but it is still very good, and I think their lineup is potentially substantially better than the Brewers. But there is also just an element, too, of kind of feeling like it's house money. Like the going into this season, obviously the aim was to be competing with the Dodgers, but the way that the roster just kind of came apart due to injuries and things, just being there, the division title was kind of the thing that it felt like was ultimately the goal for the season, or no, maybe not the goal, but the kind of the minimum sort of allowable achievement to celebrate. And the rest of this, just if they can be competitive with the Brewers, if they could get past the Brewers and into the NLCS, all that would feel really like house money, just because, literally the Braves have remade their outfield 3 times this year. And only one of their top 4 starters has not spent at least like 4 weeks on the DL. So, and the guy who you would argue is maybe their ace didn't throw a single pitch all season because of a torn Achilles that he re-tore in trying to ramp back up to pitch this season. So, just to be able to kind of pull all that back together and still put the Mets and Phillies in a hole has been pretty entertaining.
Yeah, both of our teams kind of in the same spot as the 3 seed. Nobody, I don't think, is picking them. You're going to Milwaukee. White Sox are going to Houston. And you are bailed out a little bit because Cardinals and Dodgers is not till Wednesday night. So this will be out before your take is put out there. But yeah, it's going to be fun to watch. Hopefully not everybody's turned off the podcast now that we started talking baseball, but had to get, since both of our teams are in the playoffs, had to get your thoughts there. Zach, thanks for the time. I know I think you'll be at Big Ten Media Days this week in Indianapolis. I'm not sure exactly what we're gonna learn from IU, given that we just had their media day a little bit over a week in Bloomington. But my understanding is Coach Woodson will be there, a couple of players talking about the upcoming season on Friday. Look for coverage on both Inside the Hall and the Indy Star for that. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks, everybody, listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.